Atiq, thank you so much for joining us. Just want to ask you first about your expectations for this conference. We're in the first day now.
First of all, this is the first time we are doing a community-based adaptation conference in Southeast Asia. So that's a new sort of territory geographically, new interest groups, and a lot of interest across the world. But if about 250 people have turned up for this meeting. In Bangladesh, we had about 400 people come up last year. So, yeah, there's a lot of interest going on. Let's remember, this is not the whole adaptation. This is just the adaptation issues, but those are done at the level of the communities. There are other areas of adaptation, so it's a very specific focus where a lot of civil society, a lot of government activities, but what is being done is initiated by the community themselves. So for the communities, it is not so much that they relate everything to climate change, but they realize something isn't right. Something is shifting in their life, and they're losing the control over their own production system. So they want to do something different. That's where their feeling for climate change is coming from.
And do you think community-based adaptation is gaining wider recognition? Is it becoming a more important issue?
Yes, it is becoming at three levels. At the level of the community themselves, and this I say will be manifested amongst the people, human beings, agriculture, forestry, fishery, whatever, amongst the ecosystems, where we can see that some of them are not doing so well, the drying out of the river or something else is happening, or too much rainfall at certain time, short, sharp rainfalls and episodic events. So, and extreme events are accentuating themselves. The third area is in the area of enterprises, where economic systems, whether it's a market or a shop or a larger, a small or medium-sized industry, all that. Fourth is institutions, whether it's an NGO or a local government or a larger issue of the government or an embankment. All those issues are coming to play their role. So we see that the acceptance by the community of practitioners is definitely increasing rapidly. Community of policymakers, they're recognizing there's something they can't do because it's very difficult to reach the vast majority of people in the affected areas. So they're doing it themselves. That's a sort of relief for the policymakers. But at the same time, policymakers have to define the framework, provide the financial base for this. The scientists have to understand the science a bit sharper, better, so that this vast number of people across the world do not get misled, do not get more vulnerable, and can reduce the deaths.
And do you think these various groups are working together? Is the communication between them effective at the moment?
I don't think there is that much connection between those groups. The connection is being made, but what we call connectors. That's like people like ourselves, the NGOs working in different countries at the same time. And one of the issues that came up in the last conference, the fifth conference in Dhaka, was how do we scale up these efforts? Can they be scaled up? Can they be integrated? And it's a major challenge. And that's, I think, we're in the very early stage of that one. But many of the sporadic, or as I say, episodic events taking place in different points, we see the connection between those. Some people are seeing them, but for most communities, they're engaged in their own niche, in their own ecosystem, own area. So the connections are not that much happening yet, but the conceptual framework is developing at a much faster pace than it used to. Also, the governments are taking note of it. The international system, the negotiating groups, the intergovernmental negotiations of climate change, they are taking it much more seriously. We are getting connected to them. And the funding agencies are also taking greater notice of it and saying they have not yet started funding big in these areas, but they are thinking, how do they go about it?
And this is the sixth of these conferences on community-based adaptation. I want to ask you about some of the wider trends. What will we be talking about in 6 conferences' time?
Well, this conference is looking at how do we communicate better amongst the affected people themselves, amongst the intermediaries like non-government organizations, local government organizations, other political intermediaries, etc., the international funding systems or international partners. So that sort of communication. On the concept of communication between scientists who has a different language and the affected people. Affected people want to know now and why and what to do about it. Scientists want to take the big picture in time and in a space. So, and some of this modeling are very, very difficult to do at a very district level or even a local level, let alone the level of a single river or a single area plot of land. So this scale issue, where you can plan to where you can implement remains a challenge. So we are trying to develop, I think, some communications and sorting out the language as well. I mean, just give an example. For the disaster people, mitigations mean lowering the amount of disasters and the risks. For the climate change people, mitigation means reducing greenhouse gas, and adaptation means reducing the risks. So, it's just the opposite words, but these groups are gradually coming together, which is an emergence and an event. In the early days, we were trying to sort out the concepts. I think we understand the concepts a bit better than before. However, we have not resolved it. I don't think it will ever be resolved like that, because communities are so wide-ranging groups of people.
And what's your vision for the future of community-based adaptation? What would you like to see?
Yes, it's a tiny slice in the whole gamut of adaptation. Now, climate change is here and now. Climate change impacts are going to be more intense. Climate change, even if greenhouse gas were stopped today miraculously, least likely, but even if that happened, some of the consequences will continue. Some of the impacts, say sea level rise, it will continue for centuries. Even if the greenhouse gas stops tomorrow, because the momentum has been built in. Some of the effects of areas which has suffered drought, for example, suddenly will not recover back. It will take certain amount of time. So there are time delays and lag delays in these. Looking forward, what we are trying to understand the concepts a bit better, and we are pleased with the interest we are getting from different groups of people, from the senior most policymakers, whether they are the government, the heads of the governments, prime minister, whoever, down to the local level governance and the government. They want some help, and all of them are now convinced something isn't right. And that's the language we get from farmers across the world, that we just can't seem to fathom out what's happening. Something isn't right in our life. Now, scientists trying to explain that in terms of climate change, in terms of some events. People have been saying, we had the coldest period in Washington, D.C. Now you have been talking about global warming. Well, that coldest period is a mirror image of the global warming. Very difficult to convince that message. And then you have few skeptics who try to, mess around things a bit in science. So there are problems. On the other hand, I think it's gaining ground. It's a question of finding out solutions that can be brought down to the level of the communities from the interest of different groups coming in. I'll just give you an example. There's the groups of nutritionists who want to see that food security, which means food on the plate, is not enough to define the problem, because nutrition, which is the amount of food for the human body and usefulness of the human body, they want to go to that point. So a whole group of nutritionists coming who were on the corridors in the Dhaka meeting has become a session here. So there are progress of new ideas coming in, new sectors moving in, and overall, I think we're in the right direction. But if we didn't do it, somebody will have to do it. And it's good that the scientists, the non-government organizations, the policymakers, and above all the community themselves, the community working at the grassroots, are communicating with each other, talking to each other. We have to improve this mode of talking using the language that we know best and communicate better, faster, and give some solutions which, end of the day, reduce the risks for these groups of families, villages to districts or larger communities of people.
Atiq, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Right, pleasure.